Have you ever believed in something so deeply that it felt like common sense? Something you never questioned because everyone around you seemed to accept it as truth. Only for one quiet moment to completely unravel that belief. For years, the global conversation about military strength followed a familiar script. Power belonged to the rich. Discipline belonged to the West. Endurance belonged to the few nations forged by cold winters, advanced technology, and endless budgets. And hidden inside that script was a subtle but persistent insult, one that lingered like a shadow over the Philippines. They fight bravely, people said, but they are not elite. They survive, but they do not dominate. They have heart, but not the hardest training. It was never said loudly. It did not need to be. The world whispered it so often that it felt settled, as if the verdict had already been written. Military commentators repeated it casually. Analysts nodded along. Even experienced officers from larger nations carried that assumption into briefing rooms and joint exercises. It became an illusion of global agreement, the sense that everyone knew where the Philippines stood in the hierarchy of strength. And when a belief feels universal, it becomes dangerous, because no one feels the need to challenge it. Until sometimes, someone does. That challenge came not from a Filipino general defending his own men, but from an unexpected voice, a foreign expert with no reason to flatter and no reputation for soft words. A Venezuelan naval admiral, hardened by decades of conflict, counterinsurgency operations, and multinational drills, was attending a closed defense forum far from cameras and applause. This was not a stage for diplomacy. It was a room where professionals spoke freely, where ego mattered less than experience. Someone asked him a simple question, the kind meant to confirm what everyone already believed. In your career, which soldiers train the hardest? The room waited for the predictable answer. Perhaps the United States. Perhaps Russia. Maybe one of the European forces known for rigid doctrine. The Admiral paused. Not the polite pause of someone choosing the right words, but the heavy pause of someone weighing whether to speak against the current. And then he said it, slowly and without decoration. No soldier trains like a Filipino. Not in heat, not in discipline, not in heart. At first, people assumed there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe it was lost in translation. Maybe he meant it symbolically. But the Admiral repeated himself, firmer this time, his eyes steady. He was not praising. He was stating a conclusion drawn from experience. And in that moment, decades of quiet assumptions cracked. Because this was not a social media influencer chasing views. This was a man shaped by the harsh realities of Venezuela, a country where soldiers grow up amid political instability, shortages, and constant pressure. He had trained alongside forces from North America, Europe, and Asia. He had seen discipline in many forms. And still, he chose the Philippines. What made his words so unsettling was not just what he said, but what he implied. If Filipino soldiers trained harder than those backed by wealth and advanced technology, then something fundamental about strength had been misunderstood. It suggested that endurance is not manufactured by budgets alone, but forged through environment, culture, and belief. It hinted that suffering, when met with discipline, creates a different kind of warrior, one that does not break when conditions turn brutal. The Admiral did not arrive at that conclusion easily. In fact, when he first encountered Filipino troops during joint exercises years earlier, he carried the same assumptions as everyone else. He expected smiles, friendliness, perhaps even improvisation. What he did not expect was precision under exhaustion, obedience without fear, and morale that did not collapse under relentless conditions. He watched them train under punishing tropical heat that drained energy from even seasoned veterans. He saw them repeat drills long after others slowed, not because they were ordered to, but because stopping felt unthinkable. That was the moment something shifted for him, though he would not admit it until much later. And as his words echoed in that silent room, they did more than praise Filipino soldiers. They exposed a truth the world had been too comfortable ignoring, that the Philippines, long treated as an underdog, had been quietly forging one of the toughest military cultures on earth, not in spite of hardship, but because of it. What most people never saw was how difficult it was for that admission to be spoken aloud. The Venezuelan admiral was not a man who changed his mind easily. His entire career had been built inside systems where hierarchy mattered, where doctrine was inherited, where certain nations were assumed to be superior before the first boot ever touched the ground. He grew up in a military culture shaped by scarcity, political tension, and constant uncertainty in Venezuela. Training, for him, had always meant survival. Long marches with limited supplies, exercises conducted without modern equipment, discipline enforced not by comfort, but by necessity. And because of that background, he believed he understood hardship better than most. So when he first heard he would be observing joint drills involving troops from the Philippines, he felt no excitement. At best, he expected competence. At worst, he anticipated disorder hidden behind politeness. Like many foreign observers, he carried the quiet stereotype that Filipino soldiers were courageous but informal, loyal but soft around the edges. He assumed their strength came from spirit alone, not from rigorous preparation. And that assumption followed him as he stood on the edge of a training field under a sun that felt unforgiving even to him. The first day did nothing to challenge his beliefs. The heat was overwhelming. Humidity clung to the body like a weight. Even seasoned foreign troops struggled to maintain focus. Sweat blurred vision. Muscles tightened faster than expected. He watched soldiers from multiple nations adjust their pace, conserve energy, negotiate silently with their own limits. Then he noticed something unusual. The Filipino units did not slow. They did not complain. They did not ask for relief. Their movements remained sharp, their formations intact, their responses immediate. Not rushed, not reckless, controlled. At first, he told himself it was enthusiasm, perhaps even recklessness, young soldiers eager to impress. But as hours turned into days, that explanation collapsed. Fatigue exposed everyone eventually, yet the Filipino troops seemed to operate on a different internal clock. They trained as if discomfort was not an obstacle, but a familiar companion. When drills extended beyond schedule, they did not glance at the sun or their watches. They reset and continued. When mistakes happened, corrections were swift and quiet, without shouting, without ego. What unsettled the Admiral most was not their endurance, but their discipline under pressure. In his experience, extreme hardship often produced either fear or resentment. Orders were followed, but morale cracked silently. Here, he saw something else. Obedience without bitterness, focus without tension. Even moments of exhaustion were met with calm, almost prayerful composure. During breaks, instead of collapsing into frustration, many sat quietly, sharing water, murmuring words that sounded like encouragement rather than complaint. He began asking questions, not officially, but privately. Trainers spoke of routines that began before dawn, of drills repeated not until they were right, but until they were impossible to forget. They spoke of growing up with little, of learning early that giving up was not an option because there was nothing to fall back on. For many, military service was not just a career, but a calling, shaped by family, faith, and a deep sense of responsibility to something larger than themselves. Still, the Admiral resisted the conclusion forming in his mind. He compared what he saw to exercises in the United States, to rigid efficiency in Europe, to massive formations elsewhere. Those forces were impressive, polished, powerful. But here, he sensed something rawer and more durable, a kind of strength that did not depend on ideal conditions, a training culture designed for chaos, not comfort. By the end of the exercises, his frustration turned inward. Everything he thought he knew about preparation and toughness felt incomplete. He realized that what he had mistaken for limitation was actually adaptation. Filipino soldiers were not trained for perfect wars. They were trained for real ones. And as that realization settled, it became impossible to ignore the question pressing quietly at the center of his thoughts. What if the world had been measuring strength the wrong way all along? The moment that finally dismantled the Admiral's resistance did not arrive with explosions or medals or dramatic speeches. It came quietly, almost unnoticed, during an early morning training cycle when the sky was still gray and the air heavy with moisture. He stood at a distance, notebook closed, no longer observing as an evaluator, but as a man trying to understand something that refused to fit into his old framework. The Filipino soldiers moved with a calm familiarity, as if the fatigue from previous days had never existed. There was no bravado in their posture, no attempt to impress. Only presence, only readiness. What struck him first was the way they treated one another. In many forces he had studied, competition was encouraged, sometimes aggressively. Here, excellence did not isolate. It spread. When one soldier faltered, another adjusted without command. When someone struggled under the weight of gear, hands appeared instinctively, not to carry him, but to steady him. The Admiral realized he was witnessing not just training, but brotherhood, something deeper than coordination. It reminded him of stories from older wars, when survival depended not on rank, but on trust. As the exercises continued, he found himself speaking more with Filipino officers, men who carried authority without intimidation. They spoke of training not as punishment, but as preparation for service. They spoke of faith, not loudly, but naturally, as something woven into daily routine. Morning drills often began with a quiet moment, heads bowed briefly, not for ritual, but for grounding. For many of them, the uniform was not just a symbol of the state, but of family, of prayers whispered by mothers, of promises made to communities back home. The Admiral had seen discipline built through fear. He had seen obedience enforced through exhaustion. But here, discipline seemed to come from meaning. Soldiers endured not because they were forced to, but because quitting felt like betraying something sacred. The tropical heat, which had broken stronger men elsewhere, seemed almost irrelevant. Sweat-soaked uniforms, muscles trembled. And still, focus remained. He realized then that Filipino soldiers were not trained to escape discomfort. They were trained to live inside it. One afternoon, as rain poured suddenly over the field, turning earth into mud, the drills continued without hesitation. Other foreign observers assumed the session would be halted. It was not. Movements adjusted, footing adapted. Commands sharpened. The Admiral watched as the Filipino units flowed through the chaos with startling composure. It was not perfection. Mistakes happened. But recovery was immediate. There was no panic, no visible frustration. Only persistence. Only calm. That was when the realization fully settled. What he was witnessing was not accidental. It was cultural. It was the product of a nation shaped by typhoons, earthquakes, conflict, and economic struggle. A people who learned early that stability was never guaranteed. Training here did not simulate hardship. It reflected reality. Filipino soldiers were conditioned for uncertainty, not ideal conditions. They did not need everything to go right in order to perform. They only needed each other. Later that evening, as he sat alone reviewing notes he no longer needed, the Admiral felt something unfamiliar. Respect, yes, but also humility. He thought of how often nations like the Philippines were underestimated, their strength reduced to stereotypes, their resilience treated as coincidence. He understood now that what the world mistook for softness was restraint, and what it dismissed as informality was adaptability. By the time the exercises ended, his conclusion was unavoidable. Filipino soldiers were not simply enduring difficult training, they were mastering it. They were shaped by hardship in a way that could not be replicated by money or machinery. And as he prepared to leave, the Admiral knew that no report he wrote would fully capture what he had felt standing in that field. But one truth remained clear, steady, and impossible to ignore. The world had been wrong. And the Philippines had been proving it all along. By the time the exercises moved into their final phase, something inside the Admiral had already shifted, though he had not yet found the words for it. He was no longer watching Filipino soldiers as a foreign expert measuring performance. He was watching them as a human being, absorbing a way of life that felt both unfamiliar and deeply grounding. The training no longer looked like a test of limits. It looked like a ritual, repeated day after day, not to prove toughness, but to remember who they were and why they served. He noticed the smallest details now, how soldiers checked on one another without being told, how laughter appeared unexpectedly, even in exhaustion, not as mockery of hardship, but as defiance against it, how discipline never erased warmth. In many militaries he had known, kindness was treated as weakness, something to be stripped away in the making of a fighter. Here, kindness coexisted with strength. It sharpened it. The Admiral saw young soldiers bow their heads briefly before beginning another grueling drill, lips moving silently, faith carried not as a slogan, but as quiet fuel. One evening, after a punishing day that had left foreign observers visibly drained, he watched a group of Filipino soldiers gather near the barracks. There was no formal event, no supervision. Someone shared food. Another strummed a worn guitar. Voices rose softly, not in celebration, but in togetherness. The Admiral felt an unexpected tightening in his chest. He had seen soldiers cope with stress through anger, through isolation, through bravado. What he saw here was different. These men were not escaping hardship. They were processing it together. It was then that he understood what made their training so relentless and yet so sustainable. Filipino soldiers were not carrying their burdens alone. Their strength did not come from suppressing pain, but from distributing it across a community bound by shared purpose. Faith, family, and brotherhood were not separate from training. They were the foundation of it. Every march, every drill, every moment of exhaustion was anchored to something beyond the self. As days passed, the Admiral felt his own internal armor soften. The skepticism he had worn for years no longer served him. He remembered his early days in uniform, when service had felt meaningful before politics complicated it, before survival became routine. Watching these soldiers, he felt that old sense of clarity return. Here were men who trained not for glory, not for conquest, but for duty, for protection, for the people who trusted them. The emotional peak came unexpectedly during a closing exercise meant to simulate prolonged chaos. Sleep-deprived, soaked by rain, and pushed far beyond comfort, the Filipino units maintained cohesion when logic suggested collapse. At one point, a command was misheard. Instead of confusion, there was immediate correction, calm voices guiding movement, hands signaling reassurance. The operation continued seamlessly. The Admiral felt his throat tighten. He had never seen resilience expressed so quietly, so completely. In that moment, he knew he was witnessing something rare. Not just skill, but character. Not just endurance, but meaning. He whispered to himself words he would later repeat publicly. "I have never seen this anywhere else." It was not exaggeration. It was surrender to truth. When the final day arrived, there were no grand speeches. The soldiers returned equipment, cleaned weapons, and prepared for the next assignment, whatever it might be. Life continued. But the Admiral carried something new with him, a restored belief in humanity, a renewed respect for the Philippines. He arrived expecting to observe training. He left transformed, humbled by a people who had turned suffering into strength and discipline into dignity. When the Venezuelan admiral finally returned home, people expected him to speak about strategy, equipment, or geopolitical lessons. That was his reputation. A man of structure, of analysis, of cold clarity. But when he was asked what stayed with him the most, he did not mention formations or tactics. He spoke instead about people, about faces he could not forget, about a country that had quietly redefined what strength meant to him. He realized, slowly at first, that the Philippines had not simply shown him a better way to train soldiers. It had reminded him why soldiers exist at all, not as instruments of power, but as guardians of life. In a world increasingly obsessed with dominance, the Filipino way had offered something radical. Strength rooted in service, discipline anchored in faith, endurance sustained by community. What those soldiers gave him was not admiration alone, but restoration. A return to meaning he thought had been eroded by years of conflict and compromise. He began to speak differently in military circles. Carefully at first, then more openly. When colleagues dismissed smaller nations, he challenged them. When they equated budget with readiness, he pushed back. He told them about soldiers who trained under unbearable heat without complaint. About units that moved as one not because they feared punishment, but because they trusted one another. About a culture where resilience was not taught through shouting, but through shared suffering and shared prayer. And each time he spoke, he returned to the same conclusion. The Philippines did not make him believe in invincibility. It made him believe in humanity again. In his words, the Filipino soldier was not the loudest in the room, but the last to leave the field. Not the most decorated, but the most dependable when everything else failed. That realization stayed with him, reshaping how he viewed alliances, leadership, even his own past decisions. For Filipinos hearing his testimony, something profound happened. Pride did not come from external praise alone. It came from recognition, from seeing values long lived quietly at home finally acknowledged by the outside world. Faith passed down through generations, families that taught endurance without bitterness, a national character shaped by storms, invasions, and hardship, yet never stripped of warmth. The Admiral's words did not create that truth. They revealed it. For foreign listeners, the message cut even deeper. In an age of division, the story of the Philippines offered a mirror. It asked uncomfortable questions. What if strength is not about who dominates, but who endures with dignity? What if the future belongs not to the most powerful, but to the most grounded? What if compassion, long dismissed as weakness, is actually the force that sustains courage when everything else collapses? The Admiral often reflected on a single image from his final days there. Filipino soldiers standing at ease after relentless training, uniforms soaked, bodies exhausted, yet eyes calm. No resentment, no prideful display, just readiness, just quiet resolve. That image followed him into boardrooms and briefings, into conversations about war and peace. It reminded him that some nations do not shout their strength. They live it. In a world full of turmoil, the Philippines stands as proof that compassion still exists without surrendering discipline, that faith can coexist with toughness, that resilience does not require bitterness. The Filipino soldier, shaped by hardship and guided by heart, represents more than military excellence. He represents a philosophy of survival that the modern world desperately needs. And perhaps that is the greatest revelation of all. That long before the world was ready to listen, the Philippines had already been teaching this lesson. Quietly, faithfully, one generation at a time.